Thank you, Mike, and good afternoon. The first rule of public speaking is never speak to an audience that knows more about the subject than you do. Circumstances force me to ignore that rule, but I recognize that many of you indeed do know more about the subject than I do. And I'm going to talk about some basic verities that all of you know, but nevertheless which bear repeating because they are so relevant to the topic we're going to talk about today. The pattern of the last 40 years has been that if there's an extended period of low tensions across the Taiwan Strait, that people tend to forget, at least in the United States, how sensitive the issue is and how dangerous the consequences can be if the issue is mishandled. For historical reasons, the mainland considers it a vital national interest not to let Taiwan formally separate from the mainland. Through repeated public statements, Beijing has made clear that it considers this to be a war-fighting issue. So mishandling really does have serious consequences, and we've seen intimations of that at various times over the last few decades. Equally important, for the last 121 years, Taiwan has not been under the control of a mainland government for 118 of those years, with the brief exception of the period from 1945 to 48. For 50 of those years, it was a colony of Japan. And during that period, its residents were not part of the May 4th movement that became the formative factor in modern Chinese nationalism. These considerations remain highly relevant to our topic this afternoon, which is to assess the first 100 days. Am I revealing my political preferences? Which is to assess the first 100 days of Tsai Ing-Wen's presidency. Ever since Tsai Ing-wen emerged once again as the presidential candidate for the Democratic Progressive Party, there has been extensive media attention to the dilemma she faced in seeking a different but mutually acceptable basis for the cross-strait relationship. During the 8-year presidency of President Ma Ying-jeou, the so-called 1992 consensus had served this purpose. Under this obscure formulation, all of you experts here, none of you could really provide a fully accurate description of the 92 consensus. It's never been put in writing. But under this obscure formulation, the two sides accepted the concept of one China, but each interpreted the concept in their own way. Tsai Ing-wen campaigned on a platform of maintaining the status quo across the Taiwan Strait, but she was not prepared to accept or endorse the 92 consensus with its implicit acceptance of the concept of one China, although she went further than she had before by acknowledging its historical significance. But this didn't go far enough for the mainland, which has suspended the cross-strait consultative mechanisms that had been actively utilized by the two sides for the previous 8+ years. The inability of the two sides to agree on a mutually acceptable basis for the cross-strait relationship has unquestionably clouded the outlook for cross-strait relations. But it hasn't precipitated a crisis, in part because of President Tsai Ing-wen's stated intention to maintain the status quo. So we have a situation that hasn't changed radically, but which is less, shall we say, secure than it was before the elections. Deciding how to handle this question has posed true dilemma for President Tsai Ing-wen because of the importance for Taiwan of the cross-strait relations. But Beijing too faces a dilemma over how to handle this issue, and we shouldn't forget that side of the dilemma. At the time of Beijing has consistently held to the position that the question of Taiwan is an internal matter, and it has refused to rule out the use of force to prevent Taiwan from formally separating from the mainland. At the time of normalization, however, the PRC promulgated a fundamental policy of striving for peaceful reunification of the motherland. This was an important step from the U.S. standpoint, since in the Shanghai Communique, we had made it clear that it was important for the United States that we had an interest in the peaceful settlement of the Taiwan question by the Chinese themselves. So for the U.S., peaceful resolution is a very important issue, and the mainland has declared peaceful resolution its fundamental policy, but it hasn't ruled out the willingness to use force if necessary. In the third communique in 1982, the United States government expressed understanding and appreciation for the Chinese policy of striving for a peaceful resolution of the Taiwan question. Nearly 38 years have passed now since the United States and the People's Republic of China established diplomatic relations. During this period, enormous common interests have been developed across the Taiwan Strait. The mainland has become Taiwan's largest export partner and vies with Japan as the island's largest import partner. Taiwan investors poured tens of billions of dollars into the mainland, along with many manufacturing plants. Hundreds of thousands of Taiwan business people have residences in the mainland. Direct transportation links were opened across the strait during the Ma administration, and hundreds of flights between Taiwan and the mainland take place every week, and extensive cross-strait tourism has taken place in recent years. But there has been no increase, in fact, a decrease in support for unification among the people of Taiwan. Polls show that support for unification is in single digits. The majority of respondents favor maintenance of the status quo, but if offered the choice between independence and unification with the mainland, the majority support independence. Equally disturbing from the mainland's perspective, the number of Taiwan residents who consider themselves Chinese as opposed to Taiwanese has been dropping sharply. And this has been particularly evident among younger Taiwan residents. Some polls find as few as 3% of the respondents consider themselves Chinese as opposed to Taiwanese, although some consider themselves Chinese and Taiwanese, but they're not included in the group which exclusively thinks of themselves as Chinese. The political landscape of Taiwan has also been changing in ways unfavorable to the cause of unification. In 3 presidential elections since 2000, Taiwan's voters have elected candidates from the DPP, which formally supports independence as an objective. The mainland is acutely aware of these trends and has been studying what to do about them. It recognizes that a peaceful resolution will be difficult to achieve if public opinion in Taiwan is against it. Nevertheless, while Taiwan specialists on the mainland have become increasingly sophisticated in their understanding of local conditions in Taiwan, they have thus far been unable to come up with an effective approach that would increase support for unification among the people of Taiwan. Threats to use force if necessary have helped to keep support for unification for independence from gaining majority support because of the potential consequences. That's why the majority support is for maintenance of the status quo. But it doesn't in any way increase and may decrease support for the concept of unification. The mainland has offered Taiwan a high degree of autonomy should reunification take place under the rubric of one country, two systems. But this rubric has also been applied to Hong Kong and Macau. The concept never had any support in Taiwan, and the experience of the last 20 years of one country, two systems in Hong Kong has, if anything, resulted in negative interest rates, if I can use a negative term. Why should the financial people be able to do so? At the moment, there is no viable way out of this impasse, raising the question of on whose side is Taiwan. This depends on a host of factors. China's rapidly growing military capabilities suggest that in coming years it will be increasingly difficult for Taiwan to maintain a military balance across the Taiwan Strait based on its own military capabilities. If the mainland gains a credible capability to pursue unification by military means, it will become more difficult to assess the degree of Beijing's commitment to its fundamental policy of peaceful unification. Conceivably, if political changes were to take place on the mainland in the direction of more representative governance, meaning that the differences between the two political systems were to be reduced, unification might become a more attractive proposition for the people in Taiwan, but there is virtually no evidence to support this hypothesis. One conclusion would appear to be self-evident. If patience runs out on either or both sides of the Taiwan Strait, this could precipitate a very dangerous crisis. But in a sense, both Taipei and Beijing are gambling on the future, while doing nothing to alter the conflicting perceptions on each side of the strait. Playing for time would appear to be the best approach for both parties to the dispute, but this does not change the factor that if at some point patience runs out, we have a very severe crisis. In other words, this is a case where one recognizes the possibility of a really troubling crisis, but one does not feel in a position to do anything to lower that possibility. And in fact, the trends, in a sense, are in the opposite direction. So when we think about the dilemmas that Tsai Ing-Wen faces as president of Taiwan, we have to also bear in mind that there is really serious attention in the mainland to the question of whether peaceful resolution is a viable strategy. And from the United States perspective, these trends are also not favorable in the sense that they are not increasing the possibility of a peaceful resolution, and therefore one of the fundamental pillars of our policy may also be weakening in the sense that there's a realistic possibility that that could be an outcome. So let me end on that point. I don't have a solution to this problem, but I do think it's important to keep this in mind as we talk about what's taking place on Taiwan under the Tsai Ing-Wen presidency.
Thank you, Stape.